This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. Today, we're going to take a look at the worst 2-mana cards. 2 mana may not seem like much, and you don't usually get something absurdly powerful for that type of investment, but you should still expect that whatever you're going to play at that cost at least helps you win the game, by being worth the mana and the card you invest. However, that just isn't true about all 2-mana cards. To make it on this list, a card had to be bad in 60-card constructed formats, Commander, and Limited. In other words, the card can't just be bad in one format, it has to be bad in all of them, and it has to have been bad for all of Magic's history. I think that makes sense for a card to truly be considered one of the worst of all time. Obviously enough, cards had to have a mana value of 2 to be considered. In all, there are 5,001 cards in Magic that cost 2 mana, and in this video I'll give you my picks for the 10 worst of the bunch. At number 10, it is Mog Squad. It's the only creature to make the list. It's actually sort of hard for creatures to show up on a list this broad, because most of them actually add something relevant to the board by virtue of their card type, since creatures can attack and block, and that's a lot more than any of the other cards on the list are capable of, but that's not really true of Mog Squad. Sure, it's a 2-mana 3/3, normally a really great stat line, but this card's downside makes it one of the worst cards ever printed. It gets -1/-1 for each other creature in play. This means it will very rarely be the 3/3 you want it to be, and you'll often have to pay 2 mana for the privilege of putting the squad directly into your graveyard. Even if you aren't planning on playing any other creatures, you can't really count on your opponent doing the same thing. So, unlike most creatures, it usually isn't going to be capable of attacking or blocking or doing anything significant, and that's how it ends up here. Still, being a creature does mean this has more upside than the other cards on the list, believe it or not. At number 9, I have Tower of Koiral. This 2-mana artifact can be tapped to make it so a creature can't be blocked by walls until end of turn. In the early days of Magic, they apparently envisioned walls being a much bigger part of the game than they have ever ended up being. It's like they thought every deck would be running walls as blockers. During the first few years of the game, Magic was littered with many cards that can't be blocked by walls or that destroyed walls and so forth, as if it were some sort of amazing upside, but of course it isn't, and it's something that is irrelevant on most board states. I initially had the tower even higher on the list, but it's actually the card on it that has been the most widely played in EDH, by a lot. This isn't because walls are really a thing there either, it's because there are a few commanders out there like Harobi Death's Whale that can generate some nice value out of a card that can very efficiently target things repeatedly, even while the ability is useless. This still isn't enough to keep the card from making the list since it's still awful in 99.9% of situations, but I thought it was enough of a reason to put it a bit lower on the list than I had initially intended. There are definitely better repeatable ways to target creatures that these decks should be running, but the fact it works there does make it a little bit better. To be clear, showing up in 271 decks on EDHREC isn't anywhere near impressive, it just looks amazing next to the other cards on the list. At number 8, I have Balm of Restoration, basically the colorless version of Healing Salve. The salve is already a famously bad card, and this is even worse, and by a wide margin. It costs 2 to cast, and you can pay 1 and tap it to gain 2 life or prevent up to 2 damage to a creature. In the end, you pay 3 times the mana for 2/3 of the effect of the salve, and this is on the battlefield, so it's never going to surprise anyone. This just doesn't do enough to be worth a card, even in a life gain deck. At number 7, I have Deep Water. This enchantment costs 2 blue mana, and you can pay 1 blue to make it so when you tap a land for mana, it produces blue mana instead of mana of any other type. So, this is a very roundabout way to filter your mana, and it filters it in a way that is almost entirely useless. If you had the mana to cast this in the first place, you aren't exactly desperate to make sure your lands can tap for blue mana. So if you have some random non-basics around and you're really desperate for even more blue mana, I guess this can sort of do the job, but keep in mind, you also have to use blue mana to use this ability, so you start out down 1 blue mana in the first place. Yeah, this is just a very strange card that doesn't actually fit into any real deck, so playing it is like mulliganing and throwing away a bunch of mana. At number 6, it is Steam Claw. This card is incredibly bad at hating on the graveyard. It costs 2 generic mana, and you can pay 3 mana and tap it to remove a card in a graveyard from the game. You can also pay 1 and sacrifice it to exile a single card. So the idea here is that if you're desperate to get rid of 1 card from the graveyard, you can quickly pay 2 and then 1 to get rid of it. But if you're more interested in hating on the graveyard over several turns, it can exile 1 card at a time. The problem is the mana you pay to do any of these things is awful, and it's going to take a very particular matchup for this to ever feel like it's delivering a card worth of value. There are dozens of better graveyard hate cards out there, all of which either cost less mana, exile more cards, or replace themselves when you use them, so you don't end up going down a card just to hate a little bit on the graveyard. At number 5, it is Convalescence. This 2-mana enchantment gains you 1 life during your upkeep. This wouldn't be a very good card if it ended there. 1 life a turn just isn't very much, but it gets even worse. It only gains you 1 life if you have 10 or less life. That means this is effectively a blank card for a huge chunk of the game, especially because life gain decks tend to, gain life, and being at 10 or less life with those decks doesn't happen a whole lot. Life gain is one of the most popular themes in Commander, and this card still doesn't really see any play because it does absolutely nothing far too often. At number 4, I have a couple of 2-mana cards that hate on extremely specific things that don't show up basically at all. Root Cage and Trap Finder's Trick. Root Cage is a 2-mana enchantment that keeps mercenaries from untapping, and Trap Finder's Trick is a 2-mana sorcery that lets you look at your opponent's hand and make them discard any traps they have. In the right situation, both of these are capable of doing something, but they both hate on things that basically no one wants to play. Mercenaries largely appeared in Mask's block, and they were almost all bad, and very much outshined by the more powerful Rebels, which dominated that block format. In all, there are only 43 mercenaries in the entire game, and almost all of them are terrible. You might think that this might have been useful in Masks Limited, but even there, it was such a narrow effect that it wasn't worth it. And that, of course, was the format where it would probably be at its best. Trap Finder's Trick is similar. It hates on traps, a little used spell subtype from the original Zendikar block that appears on only 20 cards. While some of those have actually been good, there's never really been a deck that is so reliant on traps that Trap Finder's Trick will consistently do something. Just like Root Cage, you might think this would have done something in Zendikar Limited, but it didn't. These do both have the capacity to become better cards, like if Mercenaries become a big thing again, or if Traps suddenly become an evergreen spell subtype. But even then, I don't really envision either of these being anywhere close to good cards. They just aren't good enough at hating on the thing that they were designed to hate on. At number 3, I have Pale Moon. This 2-mana instant makes it so that until end of turn, if a player taps a non-basic land for mana, it produces colorless mana instead. This is kind of the flip side of Deepwater. That card tried to make your lands better, but doesn't really do anything. Pale Moon tries to make your opponent's lands worse, but doesn't really do anything. Turning mana colorless can hurt your opponent a little bit, but unless they're only using non-basics, this probably won't make them skip a beat. Basically, most decks aren't so reliant on non-basic lands and colored mana that this will actually do anything, especially because it's only active for a single turn. Even as an enchantment, this would not be an impressive card, but it would at least be a little more problematic for the opponent, because it would be around until they destroyed it. But as an instant, it's one of the worst cards ever printed. At number 2, I have Parallax Inhibitor. This artifact costs 2 mana, and you can pay 1 and tap it to put a fading counter on each permanent with fading you control. Earlier we saw Root Cage and Trap Finder's Trick, which hated on extremely narrow things. This is upside for something that is too narrow. The fading mechanic. It's from Prophecy block and appears on fewer than 20 cards. Creatures with fading have a numerical value associated with the keyword and enter with that many fading counters. You have to remove a fading counter every upkeep, and when you can't remove one, you sacrifice the permanent. So the inhibitor is meant to give these cards an additional turn in play. Now, many cards with fading did make their mark on the game back in the day, so much so that I've actually done a top 10 on them, but that goes to show you just how bad this card was. People were playing cards with fading, but no one was playing this. It was just way too inefficient, and getting that extra turn out of a card was rarely worth it. This is also a pretty good lesson about the problems of parasitic design. A parasitic design is one that only interacts with something very specific from a single set or block, but is useless in Magic more broadly. They could have designed the inhibitor in such a way that it worked with fading, but actually did something with other counters too. Obviously, proliferate didn't exist at the time, but they still could have allowed this to add a counter to all of your permanents with counters on them instead, at which point the card would actually matter to more people. Instead, it interacts with only a single mechanic, and it doesn't do a good job of it either, making it the second worst 2-mana card in the game, but there is one that I think is worse, and that is Break Open. We've seen a bunch of cards on this list that basically don't do anything, but Break Open is even worse because it mostly just helps your opponent. This 2-mana instant lets you take a face-down creature an opponent controls and turn it face up. This is meant to interact with Onslaught's Morph mechanic, a mechanic we have seen return a few times since then, but the problem is turning an opposing Morph creature up is virtually always going to be bad for you. A creature with Morph can be played face down as a 3-mana 2/2, and you can pay its Morph cost to turn it face up. The creature is almost always larger once it gets turned face up, and even worse, most of the best Morph cards out there, the ones that people actually play, have some sort of effect when they get turned face up. So, for the cost of 2 mana, Break Open drastically upgrades your opponent's board, and maybe even gives them some strong triggered effect. This is one of the worst cards in all of Magic, and certainly the game's worst 2-mana card. So those are my picks for the worst 2-mana cards in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, because maybe you need some new coasters, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can become a patron or a channel member. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.